Welcome to the Ask the Geographer podcast series, brought to you by the Education Department at the Royal Geographical Society with IBG. I'm Rachel, your host, and in each episode I'll be joined by geographers from across the globe to delve into current events, publications and research, all tied to the fascinating world of geography. Today we're exploring the history of the environmental movement with Chris Church and Professor Ollie Mould from the Department of Geography at Royal Holloway, University of London. Chris and Ollie are part of a monumental project gathering stories and insights about the evolution of the environmental movement from the 1970s to modern day. Their work involves conducting over 100 oral interviews with environmental activists from around the UK. The environmental movement, as many of you know, is a powerful social movement aimed at protecting the natural world from harmful practices. It has helped shape the way we think about and address environmental issues. Today we will hear from Chris and Ollie about how this movement has grown and evolved since its beginnings in the late 1960s. Ollie, Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning.
Hi.
So, to start with, what drew you to participate in this field of research?
Well, I've actually worked in the environmental movement since the 1980s. Initially as a volunteer. After graduating, I got involved in a local campaign in Oxfordshire that was aiming to stop the M40 motorway being built across wetlands in Oxfordshire. People told us we were wasting our time, but we actually won that campaign. And the M40 now does a big curve around the wetland. As a result of that, I got a job with Friends of the Earth in London, and I've worked as an advisor and consultant since then. But I realised that a lot of people who'd been involved were getting old and some were passing away, and we really needed some way to record and research what had happened, the victories we've had, the defeats. And myself and a colleague met up with people from Royal Holloway to develop this project, and Ollie was one of them.
That's right. Yeah, I was involved a bit later on. So Chris and our other colleague Jeremy had put this proposal together, this research agenda. And essentially, when you deal it with a university, you need to be able to bolt on the contextual and, I guess, theoretical stuff, and in this case, the geographical theory, if that's the right word to use. And so we were tasked with creating a project which looked at it I guess from an activist perspective, and that's where I came in. I have a background in studies of activism and social movements more broadly, critique of capitalism and various other things. And so we compiled a team which involved experts like Chris, but also academics like myself to create a really interesting and vibrant project which looks at it from all the various angles which are needed. And here we are 2.5 or nearly 3 years later.
Fantastic. Chris, we talked about in the introduction the environmental movement started in the late 60s and the early 70s. But can you tell us a bit more about the roots of environmental movement and how far can we trace its origins, and is there any evidence to support this?
There's a couple of fairly famous ancient Greek writers writing, in 200 BC or so, deeply worried about the loss of forests on Greek islands as they were being chopped down to build boats and burn and so on. And I think there has been environmental concern all the way through. Shakespeare's father in Stratford-on-Avon was supposedly fined for having an unlicensed dung heap, which suggests there were environmental regulations in the 16th century. And really in the 19th century, concern grew. The National Trust came out of a recognition that our cities were growing very fast. And its founder wanted to create green lungs in and around the city for people who were otherwise living in very difficult conditions. The Royal Society for Protection of Birds was founded at about the same time and has done brilliant work. But I think the 1970 period was critical because that's when people started to really realise that we weren't just affecting local places, we were impacting on the planet. And I think some of that was triggered by the famous pictures of the Earth from space when the first astronauts went round the moon. And there was this tiny blue planet in the midst of nothing. And about the same time, the Torrey Canyon oil tanker disaster covered much of southwest England, beaches, in thick black oil and dead birds. We've seen a lot of these pictures, But that was the first time for a lot of people that kind of news was on the television. And I think all those things triggered a wave of concern. And I think it was also a recognition that this wasn't just about looking after things better. There needed to be political solutions, not just technical ones.
For sure. So you've talked about there's particular moments in history that have changed people's points of view. Are there any particular figures or pioneers in the environmental movement that might have actually changed the way people are thinking? And what was the motivation behind their work?
Well, very varied, I think. Nigel Haig, who was one of the leading environmental lawyers, he lived down in South London, near an area where in the late 60s there was plans for a massive helipad because they thought thousands of people every day would travel by helicopter to Heathrow. That never happened. He opposed that local campaign, but from that realised how much more needed to be done nationally. And he helped form an organisation called the Green Alliance that's been very influential. Angela King was someone who got involved in the early days of Friends of the Earth, partly because she was concerned about wildlife locally, but also about waste. She helped organise Friends of the Earth's first big action, which was to dump 1,200 non-returnable bottles outside Schweppes headquarters. Fairly famous incident. Up until that point, there'd been deposits on bottles. Now, 60 years later, we might be getting those back. And she just felt that there was too much mess. But then there was someone like Pete Wilkinson, one of the founders of Greenpeace in Britain, who in his teenage years was a mod, part of one of the big youth culture groups, riding between London and Brighton on a pepped-up scooter to fight the rockers who were on motorbikes. Classic youth stuff. And one day a friend of his passed him a book all about the environmental crisis. And 3 days later, he was cycling up to London to volunteer. So starts in all sorts of places.
Yeah, I would also just like to add, I think going back to the ideas around what Chris was mentioning about the photograph of Apollo, when they took the photo of the blue marble, the famous blue marble, I think it's difficult to underestimate the importance of that particular time period because it was 1968 that photo was taken. And at the time, in that year, there was a lot of uprisings around the world, particularly from students. We look into the famous ones in Paris, but there was in Mexico, in North Africa, in China as well. And so there was a real kind of almost a planetary consciousness of not necessarily revolution, but certainly voicing the unvoiced. And I think that the environmental movement was a fundamental part of that, even though perhaps it was embryonic. There were lots of other things that occupied people's ire at the time, including things like student fees, the Vietnam War, and everything else. But I think it's 1968 and the subsequent years were really, really important in fostering a planetary sense of communication was getting really important. Television as well was growing, all the technologies, and so we were able to communicate as a planet, and that I think really sowed the seeds of the environmental movement to come.
Yeah, Tom Burke, who was a student activist in Liverpool, went on to become a director of Friends of the Earth and is still one of the leading political environmentalists. He said, as a student, he realised how much of a mess we were in, and he simply said, I wanted people to stop messing up my planet. And it was that sense of identity with the planet and a recognition that he needed to do something that led him from Liverpool to London to be a leader. Yeah. I think for the first 10, 15 years, the environmental movement was struggling to make itself recognised. But I think in the mid-80s, we had a succession of problems. We had the Chernobyl nuclear power disaster, which spread fallout across England and many other parts of Europe. Suddenly, we weren't able to farm sheep and so on. At the same time, there was the hole in the ozone layer resulting from CFC gases. And the governments of the world recognised that as a problem, responded to the environmental movement and actually got that sorted. It was a major victory. There was also pictures of the Amazon burning. And all these things led to a big upsurge in the number of people joining groups. And then Margaret Thatcher went out to make a speech saying, "We are not just friends of the earth, we are guardians of the planet." And yeah, the Green Party at that point got 17% of the vote in the European elections, far more than they'd ever had before. And I think after that, it was not so much a matter of, do we listen to these people? It was more about how do we engage with this agenda and what do we actually do?
Thank you. Ollie, we've heard a lot about activists within the UK, but how has the environmental movement evolved in different parts of the world?
Well, I think that it's important to note that the notion of what we consider the sort of climate change and climate catastrophe as it currently stands obviously has its most dire impacts in the global south. I mean, I think that most people are agreed that the major problems are caused by overconsumption in the global north, and the impacts are felt in the global south. And so currently a lot of the global level or planetary level activism, I think, is importantly and rightly centered in the ways in which we need to make sure that those resources, if you like, in the global south are protected and people's lives and their habitats could continue to survive. And so if we look to various parts of the global south, we can see some really interesting ways in which the environmental movement is actually quite different, I think, and involves a lot of indigenous communities, a lot of indigenous knowledges. It's not very, it is obviously using a lot of scientific knowledge, but that's coupled with a lot of indigenous knowledges as well. And so we can look to, and actually not that long ago in the past as well, you remember the Dakota pipeline in America in 2016. That was about how this massive oil pipeline being built over an Indian reservation, and it was the Native Americans which came together, building on their knowledge of the sacredness of the site and how it was particularly important for their evolution and their nurturing, and that's why that was a successful campaign. But I think that even around the world, in places, Latin America, in Africa, we're seeing lots of quite specific local campaigns built around indigenous movements. So I think that's a really important part of how it happens around the world.
Chris, is there anything you'd like to add on to that?
Well, yes, I think it is. It's truly a global movement. Organisations like, Friends of the Earth has groups in 67 different countries now. And some of those are, well organised. Some of them are a lot smaller. Some of them are facing particular problems. In Honduras, they've had staff shot because they were opposing commercial forestry. And the protection for the environmental movement is much, much weaker. So it is important that we can work together as a global environmental movement and support those people who really are on the front line.
Indeed. And I think that if you look to some of the major events, and we talk about the Paris Accord, the Kyoto Protocol, and all the various COPs, which these days go to some pretty horrific places, including Baku and some of the oil-rich petro-states of the Middle East, which seems incredibly hypocritical if you think about it logically. But it's a global movement, and it touches down in very important parts of the world. And so, yeah, Chris is right. It's an important planetary movement, which involves making sure that we don't just focus in on the global north in terms of just trying to secure that. I think it's really important that we make sure that those resources in the global south and people's lives who are being affected most are looked after first.
So, Ollie, you touched on Indigenous communities, and they often play a crucial role in conservation, and as they have an excellent understanding of their local environment. How do you feel they contribute to the global environmental movement?
Yeah, so I think it's really important because the knowledge in which, or the knowledge they have of the ways in which that land is used, the way it has been used for millennia, is embedded in people's lives, in their knowledge, in their practices. It's not necessarily written down or codified. And so the first thing is understanding that and actually learning that and learning how to manage those spaces through indigenous practices and knowledges. And so that's a really important part of some of the movements that are happening. I know the United Nations, for example, have a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a framework which they put together, which is not entirely unproblematic, but it does allow for indigenous groups to put their knowledge forward as part of trying to save the spaces that they are, that they're going for. And so it's about trying to understand that knowledge is not always codified. I think some of the things, a good example is fire management. I'm not sure if Donald Trump did some horrible things when he talks about, you just need to, people aren't sweeping the forest floors enough, or whatever he said, that causes wildfires. But of course, this is the sort of knowledge which, if he had just sort of listened to some of the ways in which the indigenous communities use those forests, he would know that the wildfires have been managed for millennia, for centuries, by making sure that people knew which parts of the forests to burn and which ones to save. And so this has been going on for a number of generations, and it's only in the most recent years that we've overforested and with the rising temperatures and everything else, that system has got out of balance. So there's lots of examples all over the world in which indigenous knowledges have been usurped, if you like, by companies, by overly scientific mandates, and it's put those things out of balance. And so understanding the indigenous knowledge is really, really important here.
Well, I think it's also the case that indigenous communities have been good at really making a very strong case for their own locality. We talked at the giant UN Earth Summit in 1992. There was a range of indigenous groups from Brazil who, partly simply by turning up, who weren't, official, environmental groups, they weren't political leaders. They were simply people coming to care about their own spaces and could tell the stories of those places and really provide a different approach to caring for the environment. It is that, these are our spaces, they always have been, we haven't got anywhere else to go.
Yeah, it's also worth noting, isn't it, that I think one of the phases of the movement, Greta Thunberg, clearly, a lot of being a young woman, she's been very, very influential in changing the hearts and minds of the younger generation. But she's on record saying that a lot of her environmental knowledge comes from indigenous peoples. I think it's Helen Gualinga from Ecuador. I think she cites her as a mentor. She's in a part of the tribes over in Ecuador. So people like Greta Thunberg have been using this knowledge to try and advocate for environmentalism more broadly. So yeah, it's really, really important.
So Chris, what are the major challenges that the environmental movement faced over the years?
Ooh, there's a simple question. I think it was Mahatma Gandhi said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And I think for the first few years, the environmental movement struggled to get anyone taking it very seriously. But there were some early victories. Then people tried to mock it and ridicule it. There was all this stuff about an environmentalist is a man with a beard who wears sandals and eats muesli. And that was the definition. But I think by the 80s, people were realizing that, firstly, there were real problems. And secondly, that a lot of good environmental groups were also hiring the best experts. So they were coming into direct conflict with people whose short-term economic profit plans. And so once they'd been taken seriously, then they were facing serious adversaries. There was a further challenge, I think, once people started taking the climate crisis seriously. There was, for instance, this idea that, it's all down to all of us to do stuff. And of course, we all have a carbon footprint. But there was this idea put about, in some cases, by large oil companies, that all we had to do was to do major changes to where we live and how we lived, which let the oil companies off the hook. So the challenge there was to get away from what you might describe as greenwashing by the large companies. And equally, in some cases, the companies would say, we're keen to work with you, and would try and co-opt the green agenda. BP, the oil company, famously went through a 3 or 4 year phase where they said BP stood for Beyond Petroleum, and that they were going to be leaders in renewable energy. 10 years later, they had a change of board, and they are now all about maximising their investments in oil and gas. So how you work with governments, how you work with business, but all the time, the biggest challenge is how to keep the trust of the people who give time, money, effort, who really support the environmental movement. And that's a big challenge. And helping those people understand how they can realistically have an impact and that they are part of that big global movement. That's a challenge in itself too.
Yeah, I mean, Chris is absolutely right. It's a really important part, and I guess it would be, you look at the next few years and the sort of political movements that are happening around the world with big P, but also small P movements. There's going to be a really, we're coming to a bit of a head because the tipping points are being reached, and governments around the world are changing into various political hues, which perhaps don't. Environmentalism is not really on their agenda or not really on their radar. In some cases, deliberately so. So I think the movement has a real strong part to play in order to make sure that it is, and that the environment remains a really, really important part of political conversations.
Yeah, for sure. So if we're thinking about the future then, Ollie, particularly based on our audience for this podcast, what roles do you think youth movements and education can play in the future of environment advocacy?
Well, I'm inherently optimistic because maybe it's because of the company that I keep, but a lot of the younger people that I come across and speak to are incredibly active in the environmental movement. Clearly, we've got the Fridays for the Future movement, which Greta Thunberg was spearheading, which is still going on. Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, they have strong youth movements, and it's quite easy to sort of join them and seek them out. In the States, is it the Sunrise Movement? Is that what it's called, Chris? The Green New Deal, kind of linked to the ways in which they're trying to shift political opinion. So there's lots of big national level movements, or indeed planetary level movements that are youth led. But beyond that, I just think that they're very, with social media and technology, they're very savvy in the ways in which they communicate. They can network and bring people together. And actually, what's interesting is that the intersectional approaches that they're bringing, so talking about racism and climate change, thinking about gender and climate change, thinking about all the different ways in which the different identities which people embody and how that affects and is affected by climate movements. So there's lots of people who are really on the ball and really making sure that when they talk about the climate movement, they're centering the studies of race or the conversations about race, for example. So I think that it's a really fascinating time to be part of that movement, particularly if you're young and because it's your future. The world in which we're fighting for is a one that you guys are going to inhabit over the next few decades. So yeah, absolutely, it's really, really important.
So Chris, in your opinion, what are the key priorities for environmental movement in the next decade?
Well, really, quite simply, cut the carbon emissions. If we don't bring our carbon emissions under control in the next decade, then we are likely to face at least 3.5 degrees of global warming. The impact of that on ice everywhere, you'll start to see more sea level rise. You're also seeing more storms. We know that every degree of warming means an awful lot more water in the atmosphere, which comes down as rain and storms. Now, cutting that emissions isn't just about global agreements. It's about how we generate power. That's a big part of it. But it's also about how we travel, how we grow food, what kind of houses we build, how we ensure that all new homes in Britain and elsewhere are zero carbon. There's a huge range of technical challenges to be overcome. And there's an awful lot of bright people around the world doing brilliant things on those challenges. But there's also a really strong political challenge, which is to say this change has to start happening now. And if we don't, it's going to be much, much harder to row back after another few years of inaction. We really have to start recognizing that things have to change. That involves our planning system, our transport system, all parts of government. It's not just the Department for Climate Change or the Environment that needs to be involved. And of course, alongside that, we have the nature crisis. And from many parts of the environmental movement, that's what they're tackling. The wildlife trusts, RSPB, all those bodies. The UN has said that 30% of land around the world should be protected for nature by 2030. That's 5 years' time. That's got to be done by this government here in the UK, and I hope that they will respond to it. But one of the challenges, the priorities for the environmental movement must be to make sure that the politicians don't just pay lip service to this, but they actually recognise there's got to be some uncomfortable changes around, but the benefits from those. One of our real priorities is to show that there are solutions that can be done now that are fair on everyone and will deliver real lasting change.
Yeah, what was it Greta Thunberg says? She says system change, not climate change. And I think that sort of sums up really. There's so much systemic issues which need to be radically altered, and it requires everybody.
I mean, let's be clear, the next 10 years are the absolutely critical point. If we can make some real changes now, we can see all around the world renewable energy making huge steps forward to replacing fossil fuels. If we get over this hump of carbon emissions and can start to bring them under control, there are huge potentials for creating a much fairer, juster, saner society. But we have that huge problem to face.
You touched on the idea of youth movements within some of the major organisations, and for our listeners, how could they get involved in environmental advocacy, thinking specifically perhaps about drawing on ideas from its history?
Well, to some extent, all the way over the last 50 years, most campaigns have been fueled and built on strong local action. It's where people get involved, and there are environmental groups in every town and every city across the UK. Most of them would welcome younger people. There are a lot of younger groups made up of younger people. And there's newer, more radical groups like Just Stop Oil, but there's also the wildlife trusts who have actually got people going out doing practical stuff, whether it's tree planting or looking after nature. There's so many different ways in which people can get involved. And I think the key point for any young person is to say, yeah, I actually want to find a way that suits me. And if there's not one, then talk to a few of your friends and actually do it. One of the things, it's a lot easier to form a new environmental group now in the days of the internet than it was 20 years ago. You can make the contacts and connections. You can get your message out there. We all need to really find our inner activist and think, okay, I want to make a difference. I'm going to work out how. So yeah, look for what's going on locally, or quite simply, could I do it myself?
And I would add to that as well, the school or indeed the university that you're at or want to go to will be an ideal place to find like-minded people, and indeed they will want to help you. I mean, educational, particularly in geography, they're very, very alert to the problems, to the issues that we've just talked about, and the ways in which we need to change. And so you'll be knocking on very, very open doors if the school can help you. There's resources, there's classrooms that you can get together in, there's resources that they can use to spread the message, find local people who are like-minded. And at universities as well, there's so many different ways in which you can get involved. There's societies to join, clubs to join, networks to create. So the educational institutions, I mean, they have to adapt, they have to change, and they have to spread this message. And they are, particularly in geography. So from an educational perspective, and indeed from the discipline of geography, you'll be being involved in that. Being an activist, being an environmental activist is very much part and parcel of kind of what we do now as a discipline. So you'll be knocking on open doors.
Fantastic. Chris, Ollie, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been absolutely fascinating to learn about the history of the environmental movement, its challenges it's overcome, the role it will play in shaping our future, and we can't wait to hear more about your findings once your research is complete.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks. And I hope people out there are thinking, okay, what am I going to do about this next week?
Wonderful. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to the Ask the Geographer podcast series on soundcloud.com or your preferred streaming platform. Dive deeper into the world of geography and stay informed with our wide range of resources, many of which are available for free. School membership grants access to even more resources, including online lectures and supporting materials for both teachers and learners. Explore our resources and discover our additional offers for education at www.rgs.org/schools.